Hello everyone. So this is the first installment in the series I'm going to do about the ballad material. And I thought for this first one we would tackle Thomas the Rhymer. It's one of the more important of the fairy ballads. It's also one of the more well-known. As I mentioned in the first video, the sort of like prequel to the series, I do encourage everyone to try to find examples of these ballads actually being performed or sung. That is how they are meant to be experienced. So you're better off if you can experience them that way. In this video, I will read you one version of True Thomas, Thomas the Rhymer, the ballad, but obviously me reading it is not the same as getting to listen to it being performed. So I encourage you to go out. I'm sure there's plenty of versions on YouTube to be found. There is also, in the case of this particular ballad, a prose or a written story version that predates the ballad version. So what we have is the ballad version, which dates to roughly 16th, 17th century. And then we have an earlier version, story version, Thomas of Ercildoune, which is told like a short story, I guess is the context we would put it in today. They have very consistent themes between them, but there are variations, as I had mentioned in the other video. Anytime you see different versions of something, you're always going to have slight variations. When we talk about Thomas the Rhymer today, we're going to touch a little on the fact that different versions sometimes have different sort of key events that occur. It's important as well to note with this particular ballad, as opposed to the majority of the others, it is believed that the story is based on an actual person. It's thought that Thomas did exist at some point, probably in the 13th century, and there is some separate folklore sort of attached to him. It's kind of separate from the ballad, although also leaning into and playing on the ballad. So we'll touch on that more at the end. I just want to note that this ballad is particularly complicated because it's potentially a real person, at this point obviously from 800 years ago, who then about 500 or 600 years ago, his story was written down in this sort of short story form, and then at some point a couple hundred years after that, roughly 300-400 years ago from us now, became a ballad and has then spread and been performed from there. And of course, as with all this material, there are more modern versions. This has been retold various novelizations in the last few decades, and so it is a very popular story. It's one you'll run across quite a lot. It's one that gets referenced a lot. It's kind of an important piece in the fairy ballad corpus, I guess we would say. So I'm going to read one particular version. This version I have modernized into English, modern English, the language. You will find versions, of course, across that whole range in Middle English and Scots. Really the most popular online versions are going to be in Scots, because not everyone always understands Scots, and because sometimes people think they're understanding words because they sound similar to English words, but they have different meanings. I'm just going to go with a modern English version. Just be aware that when you do find other versions or when you hear it performed, it's often done in the original language as it should be. So there will be slight variations. In general, to sum up the story before I read it, all of the versions talk about a man whose name is Thomas. He meets the Queen of Fairy and then travels with her into her realm, into Fairy, and serves her there in some capacity for a period of time. In some versions, that's 7 years in Fairy and in our world. In some versions, it's only a few days in the world of Fairy, but it's 7 years here. So again, that's one of the details that can be different depending on the version. And then he's eventually returned to the human world and is given a sort of parting gift / curse by the queen. So we'll see how this particular version goes. And again, this is in modern English, not the original Scots. True Thomas lay on Huntly bank, a wonder he spied with his eye, and there he saw a lady bright come riding down by Eldon tree. Her shirt was of the green grass silk, her mantle of the velvet fine. At each tuft of her horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. True Thomas he pulled off his cap, and bowed low down to his knee. All hail, you mighty Queen of Heaven, for your peer on earth I never did see. Oh no, Thomas, she said, that name does not belong to me. I am but the Queen of fair Elfland, that am hither come to visit you. Harp and sing, Thomas, she said, harp and sing along with me, and if you dare to kiss my lips, sure of your body I will be. Fare me well, fare me woe, that fate shall never daunt me. Soon he has kissed her rosy lips, all underneath the Eldon tree. Now you must go with me, she said. True Thomas, you must go with me, and you must serve me 7 years, through good or bad, as may chance to be. She mounted on her milk-white steed. She's taken True Thomas up behind, and yes, whenever her bridle rang, the steed flew swifter than the wind. Oh, they rode on, and farther on, the steed went swifter than the wind, until they reached a desert wide, and living land was left behind. Light down now, True Thomas, and lean your head upon my knee. Abide and rest a little space, and I will show you wonders 3. Oh, see you not that narrow road, so thick beset with thorns and briars? That is the path of righteousness, though after it but few inquires. And see not you that broad road that lies across that lily meadow? That is the path to wickedness, though some call it the road to heaven. And see not you that bonny road that winds about the ferny hillside? That is the road to fair Elfland, where you and I this night must go. But Thomas, you must hold your tongue, whatever you may hear or see, for if you speak a word in Elfin land, you'll never get back to your own country. Oh, they rode on and farther on, and they waded through rivers above the knee, and they saw neither sun nor moon, but they heard the roaring of the sea. It was dark, dark night, and there was no starlight, and they waded through red blood to the knee, for all the blood that's shed on earth runs through the springs of that country. Soon they came on to a garden green, and she pulled an apple from the tree. Take this for your wages, True Thomas. It will give the tongue that can never lie. My tongue is my own, True Thomas said. A good gift would give to me. I neither able to buy nor sell, at fair or tryst where I may be. I'd be able neither to speak to prince or peer, nor ask of grace from fair lady. Now hold your peace, the lady said, for as I say, so must it be. He has gotten a coat of even cloth, and a pair of shoes of velvet green. Until 7 years were gone and past, True Thomas on earth was never seen. So that's sort of the most common version we find of this ballad. And as you can see, there's quite a lot going on in there. Quite a lot of fairy lore and quite a lot of material. In the prose version and in some ballad versions, Thomas meets the queen when she's out hunting. It's usually specified that she's out hunting with her 7 hounds. Well, in a lot of the other versions, like this one, she's simply out riding and runs across him. In most versions, she's riding a white horse, comparison with bells. There are alternate versions, occasionally that mention her riding a gray horse and carrying 9 bells. The color of the horse is usually significant. White kind of represents a person who's very important or noble or significant. The bells are also likely important. We see those in other stories, and it's possible that they represent a means or a method of traveling between the worlds. There's potentially a tie-in there to some Irish mythology where we see the idea of silver bells on a gold branch kind of connecting to this travel between the worlds. Sort of supposition, but something to think about. When Thomas initially sees the Queen of Fairy, the Elfin Queen, he calls her a wonder, furly is the word in Scots, and mistakes her for the Queen of Heaven, for the Virgin Mary. And that's actually something we see across an array of different fairy lore, where someone, sometimes adults, sometimes children, see a fairy woman and mistake her or think that she is Mary, the Virgin Mary, and sort of identify her that way, which is an interesting thing to think of. It tells us a little bit about what they're seeing, but also more about how this person they're encountering is just clearly otherworldly. Mostly human in appearance, but clearly there's something about them that signifies the person seeing them that they are more than just a human being. Although, of course, the Elfin Queen is very quick to correct him and say, no, I am not the Queen of Heaven. I am the Queen of Elfland. It does point out that she is wearing a green dress. Green is a color that is often associated with fairies. It's also worth noting at the end that it says that he is given a pair of green shoes. So this is something we see very commonly, the idea that fairies wear green, that it's a color that sort of belongs to them. In some places, for example, Scotland, it's thought to be unlucky to wear green because of this, because it's the fairies' color. And usually when she corrects him, she identifies herself as the Queen of Elfland, the Elfin Queen. There are a few versions where she just says she's the Queen of a strange country. Usually they're sort of the older versions. In the prose version, in the story version, which is the oldest one, Thomas, when he first meets her, basically propositions her, because I guess he feels that's an appropriate thing to do to someone he originally thought was the Virgin Mary and is actually the Queen of Elfland that he's just met. She initially refuses him, but he kind of persists. She does warn him that if they sleep together, it will affect her appearance, that she'll lose her beauty. Of course, again, in the prose version, they do this anyway. According to the prose version, 7 times until she basically sort of begs him to stop. And it does, in fact, cause her appearance to change. She goes from being very youthful and beautiful looking to sort of old and withered and ugly. Nonetheless, in the prose version, Thomas does remain loyal to her, which is fair considering he's the one who caused it after being warned that was what was going to happen, in my opinion. Either way, then of course she asks him to sort of play and sing for her, and in some versions she then takes him into her service kind of immediately at that point. In others, as with the one we read, she offers him a kiss, and it seems to be that the kiss is sort of the agreement of the service. Clearly the kiss in the later ballad version has sort of taken the place of the explicit intercourse in the earlier versions, but we still have this sort of sexual connotation even in the later ballad versions. So then in a version we see the two of them traveling together into the world of fairy. How that's described is obviously very significant, passing through all these trials and particular locations, passing through the desert, out of the realm of the living. This idea that they're wading through rivers, particularly rivers of blood. And this is a potentially significant bit of fairy lore that we find, this idea that they, all the blood that's shed on earth ends up in the water, the streams and the rivers in the world of fairy. So that's another thing to really give some thought to, something we see particularly in this ballad. And as they're traveling, of course, there's no sun, there's no moon, there's no stars, it's very dark. And he eventually gets hungry. In some of the versions, not in this one, but some of the other versions, he complains quite a bit that he's hungry. And she eventually relents and stops and takes a break. In others, they stop and take a break, and then he kind of mentions that he's being hungry. He asks for food. Sometimes where they've stopped, there's fruit growing nearby, and he'll specifically point to it and ask for that. The queen, in all of the versions, denies that and says no. It's often an apple that he requests, so there's been some speculation by scholars that the apple is supposed to represent something significant, and that's why she says no. In some accounts, she basically just tells him, if you eat the food that's growing here, it'll kill you. It's poisonous, so you can't eat it. And that's why she says no. So to sort of distract him, because he's hungry, we then see this scene where she offers to show him 3 wonders. And often in different versions tells him to rest his head on her knee, and then points out these 3 paths, if you will. They're all referred to in the same way in the text, again, as ferlies, as wonders. And she points to 3, one for heaven, one for hell, and one for fairy. And then each path is kind of characterized by how difficult it is to follow it. So the path to heaven is very thorny and difficult. The path to hell is very broad and easy. And then the path to fairy is kind of winding and beautiful and sort of off the beaten track, if you will. And then there are some versions where she offers him bread to sort of give him something to eat while they're in the midst of this journey. In others, she gives him no food at all. She just shows him the 3 wonders. So you will often see these 3 roads being referred to across other sources and in other discussions. This is not the only ballad where this idea will appear. In fact, we will be discussing another ballad that explicitly talks about it. Sometimes it's 4 paths that are mentioned, sometimes it's 3, but it is kind of this important idea that you have heaven and you have hell, and you obviously have the human world, but then you also have this other option, which is the world of fairy. And, potentially we could argue that this is a way to fit the idea of fairy into a more explicitly Christian cosmology, where it's not heaven, it's not hell, it's something else, it's something different. So she then, as we saw in this ballad, she warns him that he needs to stay silent, that he can't speak for the length of time he's with her. It's an unusual prohibition in fairy lore. We really don't see a lot of this in other material, people being warned they have to be silent. There occasionally are anecdotal accounts in folklore related to people being told not to share with other humans experiences they've had, kind of that aspect of silence. But we don't really see much relating to the idea that people need to be silent while they're in fairy or around fairies, that sort of thing. The reason for this is not given in any of the ballad versions, it's just sort of there. However, in the prose version, which is again the older original sort of short story version, what we are told is that the queen is married, and that she specifically tells Thomas that he is not to speak to anyone but her, because his life would be in danger if her husband found out that the 2 of them were lovers. And at this point, in the versions where the queen has lost her beauty for sleeping with him, she regains it. And, there's some interesting arguments that we could have here to do with sort of power dynamics, where, he sort of pressures her into becoming lovers to begin with, and it cost her her beauty, which she warned him would happen. But once they get into fairy, and she is definitely the one who is back in charge again, and kind of puts him under this prohibition, this obligation not to speak, to be silent while he's there with her, she's regained her status, regained her power, and regained her beauty. So, interesting thing to think about, the potential connection there. Either way, they get there. She is once again beautiful, and he now has to remain silent, possibly to protect him from her husband. Her husband, even in the prose version, is a kind of a shadowy, obscure figure. We don't really learn that much about him. In the prose version, in particular, is the one where he only stays for 3 days. And the reason he only stays for 3 days, again, explicitly in the prose version. In the ballad versions, we are never told why he's brought back by 7 years, within 7 years. But in the prose version, it's specified that it's because the devil is going to come to collect his tithe. I should probably do a whole separate video just about the fairies' tithe to hell, but this is a piece of Scottish folklore we find, particularly in the lowland areas, that we don't find elsewhere. We don't find it elsewhere in Scotland. We don't find it in anywhere outside of Scotland at all. And it's this idea that at set periods of time, either once a year or once every 7 years, the devil collects a tithe, a 10% tax, if you will, on the fairies. And the reason for that is, in this particular area, the belief is that the fairies exist in this space between heaven and hell. They are often viewed as beings who were forced out of heaven one way or another, but they're too good for hell. So they're not demonic, they're not in hell, and they're sort of stuck in the middle. But in this particular folkloric belief, they are seen as being sort of tenants of the devil. They have to pay him rent, effectively, to live in the land of fairy, even though it's not part of hell. It's a separate place. He's still kind of their landlord. And so there's this idea that they have to pay him a tithe. And that this tithe in particular comes in the form of members of their community. So when we see the reference, particularly in the prose version, to him only staying for 3 days because the devil is coming to collect his tithe, that's the idea. And the implication, of course, is that the queen assumes or believes that Thomas will be taken in the tithe, that he'll be given away. And again, there is folklore referencing the idea that the fairies would take others outside their community specifically to give them in this tithe, so they wouldn't have to give their own friends and family. Kind of, you can see why they would do that. So it's sort of a logical assumption here within the story as for why she would assume that Thomas would be sort of a prime candidate for the tithe. The fairies' tithe to hell will come up again in the Ballad of Tam Lin. So I will try to remember to do a separate video just talking about that before we get into that, just to give everyone a little more background on it. Either way, because the tithe to hell is coming, this is why after 3 days the fairy queen says he needs to return. The implication with him serving for 7 years in the ballad version is probably the same, that she took him and then the 7-year tithe is happening and she wants to return him before he would potentially be taken in the tithe. That is not explicitly said in any of the ballads, to be clear. It is sort of an implication based on the wider folklore and the fact that, you know, the tithe is often thought to be once every 7 years. Not always. There are accounts that make it a yearly thing, but it certainly does have strong associations with being every 7 years. So, you know, definitely something to at least keep in mind with all of this. But this is why she doesn't permanently keep him. She sends him back. In the ballad version, we see a little bit more going on before they get to fairy, as opposed to the prose version, which is a little shorter in that process. In the ballad version, the two travel together for a longer period of time, which of course we saw when we recited the ballad. And then we see her offering him an apple as his payment, with the idea that the apple will give him this gift of true speech. True speech in this context is not just that he will be obligated to only speak the truth, although that is an aspect of it. It also contains within it the gift of prophecy, that anything he says will be true. So if he prophesies or predicts something, that would be a true prophecy or prediction. The whole reason he's called True Thomas, in part, was this idea that he could prophesy, he could speak the truth, the future truth. So obviously this all being tied in with the symbolism of apple is very significant. The apple, sort of across Western culture, particularly post-Christian Western culture, has this association with knowledge and wisdom, which I'm sure was meant to be implicated here. It's why she gives him an apple and not something else. So he doesn't want to take the apple, as we saw in the ballad. He very clearly is like, if I take this, then I'm not going to be able to barter in the market. I'm not going to be able to woo a beautiful woman. I'm not going to be able to deal with my lord. It's just going to, he's aware, he's acknowledging that it's going to put him in a very bad position to kind of interact with other humans who are not known to be honest and truthful all of the time necessarily. And that it's going to put him at a disadvantage. So he really doesn't want to take it. She, however, again, as we saw, not even so much insists as just tells him that whatever she wants to happen is what is going to happen. And sort of he does have to take it. In the older versions, like the prose version, however, Thomas is given a choice by the queen between a gift of prophecy or a gift of skill with the harp, and he chooses prophecy, believing it to be the more powerful gift, the more powerful skill. I will note, of course, that the idea of the good folk of the fairies giving people the gift of music is a very old one, and we find that across a wide array of material. Not so much the idea of them giving people the ability to prophecy, although that is not exceptional or rare either. For example, the Brehon seer in Scotland is a gentleman who is said in some stories to have fallen asleep on the side of a fairy hill and woke up with a white holed stone resting on his chest, and afterwards had the power to prophecy. It was called, why it was called a seer. So this idea that the good folk can give people that ability, it's not something that we don't find at all. It's just less common. The idea of them giving people skill in music is something that's more widespread. We can find that in much more material when we dig around. So in the ballad version, we see him being offered the gift of true speech and prophecy, and he does not want it, but kind of has to take it. In the older version, the prose version, he's given a choice between prophecy or musical skill, and he chooses the prophecy. So interesting little difference there between these versions. In all of the versions, he is missing from the human world for 7 years and is then returned. And this is where we get into more folklore, not so much explicitly what we find in the ballad or the prose material, because that's kind of where it ends with both of those. They end, he's brought back, and that's all we know. However, there is quite a bit of folklore that we have relating to Thomas afterwards, claiming that he lived in the human world for a time after that, but he eventually was taken back into the realm of fairy. And the story goes that the fairy queen sent 2 deer, sometimes there's to be white deer, a doe and a stag, as a sign to him that she was coming to take him back out of this world. And that according to that folklore, like some other significant humans with connections to fairies, he saw the deer sort of when he was a little bit older, and told the people around him that was, the fairy queen was sending for him, and followed the deer into the woods and was never seen in the human world again. And the belief then is that he continues to exist, potentially still lives in the world of fairy today. So that's kind of what we have for the ballad material that's touching on a lot of the different fairy lore that's in the ballad material. I don't want to make this video an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours long, so try to be fairly concise with this, but that is the ballad. That is the highlight of the more important material. For people who are really interested in this subject, I do encourage you to potentially get maybe a written copy of one of the ballad versions and sort of take a closer look at particularly his journey to get to the land of Faerie, sort of what he has to pass through, what he has to go through. Those are also things that we see echoed in other accounts. So if you look across folklore, across anecdotal accounts at stories, for example, of borrowed midwives, you will often see not as explicit or elaborate as we find with Thomas, but you will see this idea of traveling through darkness, of going into a cave, of crossing a river. Usually several of these will happen in order for the human to get to where they need to be, potentially, in the world of Faerie. So this idea that the world of Faerie is something that can be reached, but that it kind of requires this convoluted journey, experience to get there, that is something we find across other material as well. The description of the queen, again, wearing green on the white horse, lots of layers to that. The bells we mentioned. All of this is important when you're learning and studying fairy material to kind of look at. And you will notice as we get into some of these other ballads that some of this will be repeated because these are important themes. The idea of fairy horses having bells, particularly in their manes and tails. The idea of the color green, the idea of convoluted journey to Faerie. All of these are things that we will see again. And again, this idea of the three wonders, the three paths, to heaven, to hell, and to Faerie, is something we will definitely be seeing again. So this is all kind of significant. I do also realize in this half-hour video I have thrown a lot of information at you all and covered quite a bit of ground. So obviously feel free to watch this video more than once if you need to. If you have any questions, put it in the comments. But that is kind of covering Thomas the Rhymer and sort of all the important aspects of that. Obviously we could keep going and just take it apart line by line, but I don't want this to be a 2-hour video. Next week we will jump into the Ballad of Tam Lin, which is another of the really significant and popular ballads. And then after that we'll start working into the more obscure ones. Any questions, put it in the comments. I hope people found this helpful, or at least a little educational on the subject of Thomas the Rhymer and the ballads. And I will get back to everyone in a week or so with the next video. Have a good day.